It is the morning of May 2nd, 1944, and somewhere in a quiet office at MI5 headquarters, a junior intelligence officer is doing something rather embarrassing for a spy. He is doing the crossword, the Daily Telegraph crossword to be precise. Clue 17 across, 5 letters. The definition reads simply, one of the United States. He fills in the answer without thinking, then stops. His pencil hovers. The answer is not Illinois, not Georgia, not Texas. The answer is Omaha. And Omaha, as of that morning, is the code name for one of the most closely guarded secrets in the entire history of the Second World War. A designated landing beach for the Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied France. An operation whose details, if revealed to the enemy, could cost the lives of tens of thousands of men and potentially collapse the entire Western Allied war effort before it had properly begun. He reads the clue again. He looks at the answer. He looks at the clue again. Then he puts down his pencil, picks up his telephone, and makes a call that will trigger one of the strangest counterintelligence investigations of the war. An investigation that will reach into the pleasant leafy suburbs of Surrey, drag an entirely blameless schoolteacher into a room with MI5 officers, and ultimately conclude with one of the most baffling and anticlimactic explanations in the history of wartime intelligence. The story of the Daily Telegraph D-Day crossword affair is not a story of masterful espionage or brilliant tradecraft. It is, at its core, a story about schoolboys, a very unlucky crossword compiler, and the terrifying power of pure coincidence. Or, depending on how you look at it, something stranger still. To understand why a crossword puzzle could send the British intelligence services into a cold sweat, you must understand the scale and secrecy of what was being planned in the spring of 1944. Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of northern France, was by any measure the most ambitious military operation in the history of warfare. The logistical undertaking was staggering. Across the south of England, nearly 3 million men had been assembled, along with more than 11,000 aircraft, nearly 7,000 naval vessels, and quantities of ammunition, fuel, and material that defied easy comprehension. But the operation's success depended absolutely upon one thing. Surprise. The Germans knew an invasion was coming. What they did not know, what the Allies spent enormous resources ensuring they would never know in advance, was where it would come. The deception operation, known as Fortitude, had been constructed at tremendous cost and ingenuity, feeding false information through turned German agents, fabricating an entirely fictional army group under General Patton ostensibly poised to strike at the Pas de Calais. Every piece of genuine operational information was classified at the highest possible level. The code names themselves were treated as crown jewels. Overlord was the name for the overall operation. Neptune was the naval component. Utah and Omaha were 2 of the 5 designated landing beaches in Normandy. Mulberry was the name for the extraordinary artificial harbours that engineers planned to tow across the English Channel to supply the beachhead. These words, Overlord, Neptune, Utah, Omaha, Mulberry, were known to only a few hundred people in Britain and America, circulated only on the most restricted need-to-know basis, and guarded with a ferocity that had no peacetime equivalent. They were not, it is fair to say, the sort of words one expected to encounter in a broadsheet newspaper puzzle. And yet, the Daily Telegraph crossword had been a fixture of British daily life since 1925. By 1944, it had acquired the status of a national institution. A daily ritual, for the commuting classes, something to be contemplated over breakfast or folded under the arm for the train. Its compilers were a small and largely anonymous group of dedicated puzzlers, one of whom was a schoolmaster named Leonard Sidney Dorr. Dorr had been setting crosswords for the Telegraph since the early 1930s, combining his vocation as headmaster of the Strand School, then evacuated to Effingham in Surrey, with a sideline as one of Britain's most prolific and respected setters. He was, by all accounts, an entirely unremarkable man. Clever, methodical, a little austere, devoted to his school and his puzzles. It was Dorr's crossword that appeared in the Telegraph on May 2nd, 1944, containing the answer, Omaha. Taken in isolation, this might have been dismissed as coincidence. Omaha was, after all, a city in Nebraska, a perfectly legitimate answer to a clue about an American state. But it was not isolated, not even remotely. On the 22nd of May, another Dorr crossword yielded the answer, Overlord, the code name for the entire invasion operation itself. The clue, rendered innocuously enough, offered some oblique classical reference. The answer was unmistakable. On 27th May, the answer Mulberry appeared, referring, the clue suggested, to some obscure horticultural or botanical matter. And on June 1st, a full 5 days before the invasion was to begin, the word Neptune appeared in another door puzzle. Overlord, Neptune, Mulberry, Omaha, and a few weeks earlier, completing the set, Utah. 5 top-secret D-Day codenames. 5 separate crossword puzzles. 1 compiler. In the 5 weeks immediately preceding the largest amphibious assault in history. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The response from British intelligence was swift, if somewhat undignified. 2 officers from MI5 arrived at the Strand School's evacuation site in Surrey and presented themselves to Leonard Dorr. We do not have a verbatim account of the conversation, but we can reconstruct its essential character. 2 serious men in good suits, attempting to explain to a bemused schoolteacher why his hobby had apparently constituted a threat to Allied operations in Europe. Dorr, by most accounts, was baffled and indignant in equal measure. He had no knowledge of any D-Day codenames. He had never heard of Operation Overlord in any official capacity. He was a schoolmaster. He set crosswords, that was all. MI5 cleared him. Then, a few days later, presumably because someone noticed that the puzzles kept coming and the codenames kept appearing, they came back and investigated him again. They cleared him again. The Germans, so far as anyone could determine, had received no intelligence advantage whatsoever. The Abwehr had not contacted Dorr. No messages had been sent to Berlin. The crosswords had been submitted to the Telegraph weeks in advance of publication, as was standard practice, ruling out any responsive encoding of intelligence received late in the planning cycle. The invasion proceeded on June 6, 1944. The beaches were taken. The Germans, misled by fortitude and genuinely surprised by the Normandy landings rather than the anticipated Pas-de-Calais assault, failed to concentrate their armour decisively enough in the critical early hours. The codenames in the crossword had, it seems, made no operational difference at all. But the question of how they got there, that was a different matter entirely. To compare the British intelligence response to the crossword scare with the German equivalent is to be struck immediately by the asymmetry. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, was by 1944 in an advanced state of dysfunction. Almost every German agent sent to Britain had been turned or captured. The celebrated double-cross system, run by MI5, had given British intelligence effective control over the entire German agent network in Britain. Every message sent to Berlin by ostensible spies was composed or approved by the British. The Germans believed they had a network of active agents. In reality, they had a chorus of marionettes whose strings were held in London. The American Office of Strategic Services had, for its part, its own anxieties about the crossword affair. American intelligence officers were no less alarmed than their British counterparts when the codenames began appearing. The OSS, founded only in 1942 and still establishing its institutional confidence, was perhaps even more prone to worst-case interpretations. The internal deliberations on the American side, such as can be reconstructed from declassified records, reflect a genuine belief, held at least briefly, that the source might be a sophisticated leak rather than coincidence. No German equivalent of the crossword scare exists. That is to say, no documented case in which the Germans discovered an accidental disclosure of their own operational codenames in a German-language publication and launched a frantic investigation. The German security apparatus, the SD and Gestapo, operated by different methods and with different cultural assumptions. The idea that a newspaper puzzle might constitute a security threat would likely have seemed too absurd to investigate. The British, characteristically, investigated it twice. The real explanation, or what is generally accepted as the most likely explanation, did not emerge fully until decades after the war, and even then rested largely on a single account provided by one man. Dorr himself, in later life, reportedly admitted that he had occasionally asked pupils at his school to suggest words for his crossword grids, a common enough practice among compilers struggling to fill awkward corners of a puzzle. And Dorr's school, evacuated to Effingham in Surrey, was situated in a part of England thick with Allied military preparations. Canadian troops were billeted in the area, American soldiers moved through. In the exuberant and chronically indiscreet way of servicemen everywhere, some of these soldiers had, apparently, let the code names slip in conversation, probably believing them to be obscure technical terms rather than the most classified words in the English language. The boys had absorbed them. Children, as any teacher can confirm, listen far more carefully than adults give them credit for. These boys, fascinated by the soldiers around them, had picked up Utah, Omaha, Overlord, Neptune, Mulberry as interesting sounding words without having any idea what they meant. And then doing what boys do when a schoolmaster with a crossword compiling hobby asks for suggestions, they had offered them up as answers. Dorr, for his part, would reportedly confirm elements of this account late in his life, though precise documentary evidence remains elusive. He took the secret, if secret it was, largely with him. He died in 1963. A student named Ronald French, interviewed in the 1980s, gave a more detailed version, that he personally had overheard Canadian soldiers using several of the words, and had passed them to Dorr as crossword fodder, and that Dorr, recognising only that they were unfamiliar words that fitted his grid, had used them without suspecting their significance. French's account is compelling, but stands largely alone. Other researchers have questioned elements of the timeline, noting that some of the puzzle submissions predated the periods when the relevant code words would plausibly have been circulating among soldiers near Effingham. The precise and definitive truth of what happened may never be fully established. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that Leonard Dorr was not a German spy, that the Daily Telegraph crossword was not an instrument of enemy intelligence, and that 5 of the most sensitive code words in Allied planning history appeared in a national newspaper in the 5 weeks before D-Day, for reasons that were, at root, entirely human and entirely mundane. The legacy of the affair is disproportionate to its operational significance, which was essentially zero. It did not compromise the invasion. It did not alert the Germans. It did not cost lives. In material terms, the Daily Telegraph D-Day crossword panic was a counterintelligence investigation that discovered nothing because there was nothing to discover. And yet it endures. It endures because it illuminates something genuinely important about the fog of wartime intelligence. The way in which pattern recognition, the essential tool of the analyst, can become a liability when the mind is primed to see threat in everything. 5 code names in 5 weeks was, statistically speaking, remarkable. The probability of that coincidence occurring by chance, given the number of possible crossword answers and the number of top-secret code words in circulation, was low enough to justify at least a raised eyebrow. MI5 did precisely what a competent intelligence service should do. They investigated. They were simply investigating something that turned out to be nothing. The affair is also a remarkable testament to the robustness of the Overlord security apparatus despite this bizarre anomaly. The fortitude deception held. The Germans remained convinced, through and beyond D-Day itself, that Normandy was a feint, and the real blow would come at Calais. Rommel was at home for his wife's birthday. Hitler was asleep when the landings began, and his staff were afraid to wake him. The most powerful military deception in history did not unravel because a Surrey schoolmaster used 5 inconvenient words in his puzzles. No original copy of the specific crosswords is on permanent interactive display in any single dedicated exhibition, though the Telegraph itself has reproduced facsimiles on anniversaries of D-Day. The puzzle grids themselves are unremarkable, black and white, modest in size, entirely typical of the form. What they contain is the echo of a moment when the entire Western Allied war effort trembled briefly at 5 answers written in pencil by an unknowing schoolteacher. Return then to that MI5 officer in his quiet office in May 1944, pencil in hand, staring at the word Omaha. He could not have known, in that moment, what chain of events he was about to initiate. He could not have known that the answer to his alarm would turn out to be not a spy ring, not a sophisticated German intelligence operation, not a mole in the heart of Allied planning, but a schoolmaster, some enthusiastic boys, and the terrible democratic promiscuity of the English language. The way words circulate, are overheard, are passed from soldier to schoolboy, to crossword, to newspaper, to the eyes of an intelligence officer, doing his morning puzzle on the train. The code names had been gathered from the air, the way information always travels in wartime, slipping between the cracks, in even the most rigid security apparatus, not through treachery or ingenuity, but through the ordinary, unguarded conversations of men who did not understand what they knew. 5 code words, 5 puzzles, 3 million men waiting in England. And on the other side of the channel, a German intelligence apparatus so thoroughly compromised that it could not tell the difference between a spy and a schoolboy. Not because German intelligence was incompetent, but because British intelligence had made certain, at enormous and painstaking effort, that they would never get the chance to try. The Daily Telegraph crossword did not betray Operation Overlord. The Strand School's evacuated pupils did not betray Operation Overlord. Leonard Dorr, headmaster and crossword compiler, did not betray Operation Overlord. Overlord was protected not by perfect secrecy, there is no such thing in war, but by a deception so complete that the enemy had no reliable framework within which to evaluate what was true. The Germans, in the end, were not defeated by the clues, they were defeated by the answers. And those answers came ashore on the beaches of Normandy on the morning of June 6, 1944, in the largest military invasion the world has ever seen. The puzzle, it turned out, was not the crossword. The puzzle was the entire war, and the British had already filled in all the difficult squares.